Okay, so this title is very clickbaity, but I just want to make it clear that I don't actually think El Toro will get the RMC treatment. As much as I am one of those people that wants as many RMCs as possible, I don't think that El Toro will be one of them. This video is more of, what could El Toro look like if it was RMC'd? I'm gonna dive into the layout and see what RMC could potentially do with this. So first of all, El Toro has 4 iconic elements that the park would probably want to be retained from the previous layout. These are the first drop, the 2 camelbacks, and the rolling thunderhill. Everything else could be spiced up to make this coaster even more elite than before. I'm sure most of you know the basic idea of El Toro's layout, but here's a quick review. There's a little turn after the station, the cable lift, the turn after the lift, the first drop, the 2 camelbacks, the big turnaround, another big turn with a drop at the end, a speed hill, the rolling thunderhill, the S-turns, switchback hills, and then the final brakes. The turn before the lift I originally had banking outward like Untamed, but I later decided against it, and I'll tell you why when we get to that. This lift hill is about half as fast as the cable lift on El Toro, so the speed is made up for with a small dip that leads into the 180-degree turn, giving the train a little more momentum into the first drop. I originally wanted to have some sort of first drop similar to Hakuge, except with a 180-degree turn, kinda like what I did for my RMC conversion of the Boss a year ago. But this would shift the entire first drop forwards because of that little rise in elevation before the drop. Compare this to how El Toro plunges directly into the first drop, and it's quite a big difference. This is important because of how tight the valley on El Toro's drop is. The small valley allows for the placement of the first airtime hill to be directly next to the station building. With RMC conversions, I generally go for a maximum of 3.5 Gs at the bottom of the first drop, which results in a much wider pullout from the first drop to maintain the lesser G-force, making the pullout of the drop a lot wider, as well as significantly offsetting the placement of the first drop, makes it impossible to follow the path of the first 2 airtime hills on El Toro. So I removed the little elevation change before the drop and had it plunge straight into the drop similar to its predecessor. But that's not all. I decided to move the outer bank from the pre-lift to the top of the first drop, similar to what I did for my RMC conversion of the Beast at Kings Island. So the train will be banking outward around this turn 180 feet off the ground, and the banking doesn't level out until the train starts to crest the drop. So riders are getting quickly rotated back to a banking of 0, right as they are being yanked into the first drop, which would be an extremely unique sensation. The back row will get negative 1.3 Gs, making this definitely one of the best first drops in the world. The drop will be followed up by the 2 camelbacks that follow the exact path of the camelbacks on El Toro, but the shaping is slightly modified to adjust for the much shorter train. This was so that the forces would remain at a similar level, as both hills pull around negative 1.2 or negative 1.3 Gs. While both of the hills are profiled in a similar manner to the camelback on Zadra, the train absolutely hauls over these hills, providing unbelievable ejector airtime, hopefully carrying on the legacy of El Toro's legendary airtime hills. Now, this is where El Toro heads into its turnaround, a section that is notorious for being rough. The RMC conversion will not only smooth it out, but I added a 0G roll to take the place of the 90-degree bank. This roll is traversed similarly to that of the Steel Vengeance's first inversion, and the profiling also looks very similar to Iron Gwazi's death roll when viewed off-ride, but of course the train is traveling up through the roll instead of descending down into it. The turnaround isn't anything too crazy, as it just pulls some moderate sustained positive Gs. RMCs aren't designed with excessive positive G-force, so I kept it limited here. The train will then head into a very powerful step up, like a more low-to-the-ground version of Steel Vengeance's airtime hill right before the mid-course brake run. This will pull around negative 1.1 Gs for the entire train, before the track sharply banks to the left and heads into the ride's second inversion. This element would replace this large drop on El Toro, an element often deemed underwhelming by those who have ridden it. This second inversion is loosely based on Steel Vengeance's second inversion, with the fact that it is kind of like a descending 0G stall. The train banks to the left before whipping to the right until it hits 180 degrees, and then it quickly rotates back. Next up is what used to be this drawn-out speed hill, but I replaced it with a trick track double up inspired by Storm Chaser. This element delivers 2 violent pops of negative 1.1 G airtime as the track banks back and forth. El Toro would then head into the famous rolling thunderhill, which is preceded by this swooping turn. I decided to add a little airtime pop going into this turn, inspired by what Iron Gwazi does between its 2 wave turns. This leads into the reincarnated rolling thunderhill. I modified the shaping of the hill in order to create an airtime moment that feels very similar to El Toro's rolling thunderhill, but adjusted for the shorter RMC train. The hill appears to be much more drawn out because the airtime starts out at some weak ejector factor at like negative 0.6 Gs. But the radius of the crest gets tighter as the hill progresses, so back row riders will get a violent burst of extreme airtime, which is reminiscent of the element that this replaces. Front row riders only receive around negative 0.9 Gs of airtime, which is still crazy, but back row riders receive upwards of negative 1.5 Gs, which is insane. El Toro then heads into the twister section of the ride, which is a section that some people like, but most reviews deem this portion as underwhelming. It features these back and forth S-curves, which I could have just retracked to make something like the end of Wildfire, but I decided to replace it with these rapid fire barrel rolls, inspired by those found on Air Force 1. The track rolls to the right into the first barrel roll before hitting a sharp corner and flying into the second barrel roll. Both of these barrel rolls produce vicious whip and upside down ejector airtime, around negative 1.1 Gs on each of these barrel rolls. This leads into a drawn out low to the ground turn that pulls some moderate G-forces. At this point in the layout, El Toro has the back-to-back switchback hills, but because of how drawn out those hills were, the flow is actually way better when I made this into more traditional airtime hills. That way, the element flows more like a double up, just with a turn between the two airtime hills. And this final airtime pop is very powerful, delivering negative 1.2 Gs on this finale that is intended to be reminiscent of Iron Gwazi's final drop. This crazy moment leads into the final brake run. Looking back, if I had to change anything, I would probably smooth out the transition from the step up into the 0G stall, because it doesn't really flow how I intended. Also, the transition into the first barrel roll from the Rolling Thunder hill is also a little weird, but there's not really anything different I could have done with the turn other than make the shaping on the Rolling Thunder hill more drawn out and less forceful, which is not something that I would do. If you guys enjoyed the video, make sure you're subscribed and check out a similar video I made for American Eagle at Six Flags Great America.